So far on Weigh In, we've had the thoughts of CEOs, we've had comments from the crowd, we've had people coming in and giving their opinion after having... Oh no, we haven't had that yet. I was just going to say people coming in having their opinion after 10 years on the bench at trackside. But that's coming up as we have a look through the Messara report. We're not going to look through it. We're just going to view it with, what, 4 to 6 weeks up our sleeve from an arm's length back. And because Luke's been so passionate out the back...
You got any thoughts on this, Luke?
I don't know how we're going to fill the next 10 minutes.
I thought I'd start with George. What skin have you got in the game, George, these days? No, seriously, what skin have you got in the game outside being up in the clouds and the commentary boxes?
Look, I've got a vested interest in this game. This is, it's my livelihood, this industry, not only as a broadcaster, but my wife and I, we race horses, we breed from mares as well, and it's very tiring for the lack of return that we're getting, you know. I'm a firm advocate of the Messara report. I know this is going to upset some people, but I reckon we should just implement what the Messara report says, and the sooner we do it and give it a crack, the better off we will be.
We'll get back to that.
I think he's
most
pretty
most
fired
I
up.
think like the Messara report, about 80% of it, Luke, don't they? Genuinely
Yeah, I
speaking.
guess. And look, I don't have skin in the game anymore. I'm 10 years out of it, as you say, Sheldon, but I'm cursed with still caring, and that's the main reason I wanted to be here today, was to speak about this. I'm grateful for the fact that we have a Minister of Racing who gives a damn, because there have been plenty in the past who haven't. I'm grateful for the fact that John Messara, who's clearly a very capable person, has been enlisted to put this report out. But I don't think we should be blindly following everything that goes into it, and there should be other options considered. Look, there was, and I apologise in advance that if I get a bit monologue-y rather than conversational.
We've got 8.5 minutes,
TV.
8.5 minutes just to give you something in your head.
The one thing I wanted to see come out of this report was a change to the governance structure, because the New Zealand Racing Board is run on an archaic model that isn't fit to compete with the kind of international corporate entities that it now has to compete with. Usually in most companies you have a structure where there's a board of directors and a CEO who reports to them, and the board of directors have that single goal of maximising profitability. They might disagree about how they get there, but they have that single goal. The racing board is structured with input from 3 code representatives whose job there is possibly to advance the greater good, but more so to get the better piece of the pie for their individual code. It's not conducive to good governance. It's conducive and gives rise to decisions being made for political reasons rather than for the overall greater good, and it also leads to overall inertia. Nothing happens, and that's the problem. That's why I say there's only one problem in New Zealand racing. Everyone can point to 1,000. There's only one problem in my mind, and it's the poor governance structure. And that was what I was wanting to see come out of this, because people can talk about the tracks, and everyone talks about the tracks. It's the most relatable part of the report, which ones are going to be closed, which ones aren't. But that's a secondary issue. The problem is not whether we have too many tracks for our population. The problem is that since the Reid report in the 1960s, everybody said we've got too many tracks for our population, and nothing has happened, and nothing will continue to happen. So, with that as background, I was interested to see what the Messara report would do about that, and I was hoping there would be a consideration of options, a fully independent board, a corporate model with industry control maintained, but proper corporatisation, or potentially even privatisation, even though that's a bit of a dirty word in some political circles. The key part of the Messara report is about halfway down page 13, and it's mentioned again on page 39, where it said that he hasn't considered any of those options because there's no political appetite for it, and it's basically outside of the ambit of his report. And he says, I'm only therefore making recommendations essentially within the status quo.
So at that point you rip it up?
I don't rip it up, but I think that fact is a bit of a disappointment, because you're not considering other options. And so what he's proposed there in terms of the governance structure is the separation of racing from wagering, but still maintaining basically the same governance structure with the code representation into the board and such. No particular proper corporate competitive model, and then the sale of the wagering part of the business. Essentially, they talk about it being a lease outsourcing, but it is essentially a permanent thing, if we want to talk about that too, if we've got time.
So is the answer to that then that George and a certain area of the sport wanting to push this through and maybe hand it, George, over to the Australians. John, you've made the report. Next wave is, John, you and your mates sort it out for us because we haven't in 50 years.
Well, no, I take on board what Luke said there, but yeah, so what you're saying is, and reading between the lines, the New Zealand Racing Board is gone. It'll go. Under this Minister for Racing and with the recommendations from the Messara report.
One of the telling things last week with John Allen was that John Allen can't talk, apparently, to Winston Peters. Journalists
that was staggering last week.
But journalists can pick up the phone and get him on the phone in 30 seconds.
You read in the Informant this week that Brian Delore can pick up the phone and ring the Minister for Racing as he's about to get on
That's not a negotiation on any terms.
It's not.
It's preordained.
It's not good, but I wouldn't necessarily blame John Allen for that. But it's whoever's to blame. It's not.
He can't communicate with the minister.
No, exactly.
Which starts to feel then like that, you know, the accusations of payoffs for people who may have supported you into government might be coming into play.
Can I just say I totally agree. I totally agree. Can I just say I understand everybody's frustration with the New Zealand Racing Board. As I say, it's been an ineffective governance model for many, many years, and it's perceived rightly or wrongly as being bloated and inefficient. And the Messara report notes that the staff employment costs sort of doubling over 10 years.
And the New Zealand Racing Board is just this version of that.
That's exactly right.
And in their defence, they've been trying their best, I suppose, but they need to sharpen the pencils. They've blown out the budgets.
To outsource it to Australia would be, in my view, to cut off your nose to spite your face. And it's all very well to say in the report will have these economies of scale and such things, and there'll be all these savings. We don't know that, but think about it for a moment. Who's going to pay a big sum of money to take over this part of the operation unless they actually get control? They're not paying to take betting on New Zealand racing, because in the internet environment, any operator out there that wants to bet on New Zealand racing can, and they do. They need control, and it will only have the value they'll pay for if they can control, for example, the time slot. An Australian betting agency is not going to want any New Zealand races after 2 o'clock because they have races for Africa in that time. They will want to put it in the 11 to 2, 10 to 2 sort of time slot. Is that what we want? The broadcasting arm also being farmed out? Is that what we want? I mean, this show won't exist. They're not going to have you're not going to have a New Zealand racing show, and I know everyone might be saying it's a good thing given the presenters on today. But really, also, the other thing, an overseas operator on a lease of the operation doesn't have to think long term. The New Zealand Racing Board at least has shows like this, which are hopefully, whether we succeed or not, hopefully to grow the next generation. Somebody's got a lease for 10 years. It's like driving a rental car. They don't have to worry if they're riding the clutch. And at the end of that 10 years, I asked you, what happens? Because in the 10 years that's happened, or 15 years or whatever it is, the racing board dissipates. People find new careers. Infrastructure falls away or is sold. When that lease comes up for renewal, they're going to have you over a barrel because you don't have the option of waving a magic wand and continuing with the New Zealand Racing Board.
I suppose you could relate it to the situation a few years ago when Rights and Bloodstock sold up, and Rights and Bloodstock, as we knew it, the main auction house of the thoroughbred breeding industry, was taken over by Peter and Philip Feller. And they had the funds and the support to go in and buy it and set it up. Now, if that had been outsourced to an Australian company, I guarantee our Caracas sales, as we know it now, would not exist. We'd be fourth tier.
That's right.
And so we've got to take that on board, and then Luke makes a valid point too.
The racing board, whether you think it's an underperforming asset or not, it's still a big asset, and you don't sell it without really close consideration. And it is a sale, as I say. A long-term lease is effectively the same as a sale in this context. I think it would be a big worry. And I'm not slagging off the Messara report. I'm absolutely not. I think it's a really good piece of work, although I have problems that he maybe wasn't given the scope that we would have liked. And I say I'm very happy that we have a Minister of Racing who cares. I just hope before we jump on this train, everyone seems to agree the racing industry is a little bit lost, but before you jump on the train, you actually want to be sure that it's going to the destination you want and consider some of the other options. Because I don't think on a proper corporate model, the racing board is a dead duck. There's no reason it can't perform. There's actually no reason it can't compete.
I think the other point too, and it's a significant point that Luke made as well, is we've got a Minister for Racing who actually cares about the industry. And he was given the support from the racing industry with a party vote, and that's why he's the second most powerful politician in the country. Now, if he's batting for us, surely we can get out there as an industry and support him.
Is he batting for everyone, though?
Well, look, there are going to be casualties anyway, but
support
the other option, if by not doing anything, it's just more of the same. Can we afford to do that?
Yeah, but you know, some of the pushback is, you know, you see the pushback coming in. Okay, it's initially clubs and tracks and closures, but you know, when you see things on a sheet of paper that say Kamara is going to be the track on the West Coast, every West Coaster will tell you that's ridiculous. The same for Waikawaiti. You see $30 million dedicated to you know, artificial tracks in 3 areas, not just all in one where they probably only need one, which is Waikato. It's got to be spread in true New Zealand racing fashion. Well, you've got one, we've got to have one as well. Decisions that are, not decisions, but ideas in the Messara report, that gives me doubt that anyone who's been in and around the game for the last 30 years is capable of pulling it off, and as you say, heading New Zealand racing in the direction that it absolutely needs to go, because if it doesn't get there this time, it just crashes and burns, and there won't be anything rising from the ashes, I don't think.
Well, I hope that's not the case, Sheldon.
We all hope that, but that's what it looks like.
My point is, it shouldn't be... Why is this being framed as only two options? Blind following of everything in the Messara report, or doing absolutely nothing?
Well, I don't know if it's
have to be that way.
I think there's a bit of wooing up the train. So hang on a sec. If you go on the George and the way that a lot of people are pushing, let's just get this through and plough it through and get it going. We'll sell Avondale. Everyone has to agree, and we get rid of the racing board, sell the tracks. We've got the money in the bin
without even thinking about it.
Yeah, you know,
I think John Messara's put a lot of thought into it, and his advisors. And what he's saying
he wasn't able to consider the options.
But the people who are looking for that aren't wanting to woo up the truck and say, hang on, you can't just shut Kamara. You can't just spend $30 million in 3 tracks. We don't know. Let's start with one and see how it goes. You can't do it in 5 minutes is what I'm trying to say.
The tracks are a red herring.
Yeah.
I think this is about two things: the sale of the outsourcing of the racing board and the governance structure. Everything else is dwarfed in comparison to those two issues. And
I think, you know, the broadcasting, can you separate the broadcasting from the nuts and bolts in terms of the outsourcing contract? Because, you know, you watch Hastings yesterday, you know, New Zealand invented the TAB. We invented race horse television. You know, and to be brutally honest, even though, you know, we watched Flemington and Randwick yesterday and they cover it well, they're 10 links behind us. The only time that Australian racing is covered better on Australian television than New Zealand racing is covered on New Zealand television is when the networks get a hold of Melbourne Cup Week. Yeah. Past that, we've got links on them. And you don't, as you say, you don't throw that away with some sort of deal with Tabcorp or whatever to say, look, we'll have the broadcasting rights as well as the nuts and bolts.
I agree with that. I do agree with you, Sheldon. And again, people like to trash trackside, and that's fine, but the coverage, and I say this as somebody who's been out of it for 10 years, the coverage of New Zealand, and I've no vested interest, the racing board aren't paying me to say this, the coverage of New Zealand racing has never been better. The New Zealand punter has never been better served. And you're going to throw that away, I think it would be, not throw it away, but give away control of that to somebody who may just treat it as filler product for an Australian market with 60 seconds of lead into your Group 1s, which are run on a Saturday morning.
Final thoughts before we wrap it up? Be careful now, or are you still 100% go for it?
I just want to see something done. Right. I'm over sitting around waiting for people to talk about things and going through it. Let's just have some leadership, implement the Messara report.
And you're saying that's dangerous?
Yeah.
Straight away.
I'm saying think about it.
Slow down.
I'm saying think about
50 years.
But why aren't we thinking about a corporate model? Isn't that the obvious option here? Something akin to a state-owned enterprise. If privatisation is a dirty word in left-leaning political circles and they don't want that on the table, fine. And if you at least consider a corporate model. Yeah,
if you're as passionate about it as we are, don't forget the submissions close on October the 19th. I say try and get us back again next week and discuss it a wee bit more.
No, you're digging up another corpse next week, aren't you?
Oh, are we? Okay.
Yeah, no,
I'm going to try and get Winston Peters and Alan Jackson and people like that on the show in the coming weeks to talk more about the Messara report. Next week we'll probably be talking about the Everest a wee bit because it's the sprint race of the hemisphere coming up as the highlight of racing next week, and we'll cover it off on Weigh In. Until then, mā te wā.